In 2020, ENHYPEN debuted with a song about not knowing if they deserve to be there. Most groups debut with something that announces them. ENHYPEN debuted with a song questioning whether their spot was given to them or something they actually earned. There's a huge difference between those two things, and they knew it. Even though the members didn't write the song, they meant every word of it. Sunoo, days after being selected, was already filming video diaries about needing to prove he deserved a spot. Jungwon said the lyrics reflected their current situation, a group that millions of people had just voted into existence, and not one of them was sure they belonged there. These were kids who'd just survived one of the most watched survival shows in K-pop history. The whole industry was paying attention to them. In a way, they'd made it. So why didn't it feel that way? To understand that, we have to go back to the show that constructed those doubts. If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about ENHYPEN just like this, consider subscribing. On September 18th, 2020, a 16-year-old named Jungwon placed first. Out of every trainee in the building, out of every person the global audience had been watching for months, the public chose him above everyone else. He'd never even imagined debuting. He said he still couldn't believe it was real.
그래서 만약에 내가 데뷔를 하면 무슨 모습일까를 상상을 한 번도 안 해봤는데 딱 오늘 엔하이픈이라는 데뷔조 1등으로 이렇게 데뷔조로 돼서 솔직히 지금도 아직까지도 실감이 잘 안 나는 것 같고.
Here's what's so interesting. ENHYPEN weren't decided by industry professionals evaluating who was ready. 6 spots went to whoever the global public voted for, and only 1 went to the producers. No mentors, no judges, no one who'd spent years understanding what a debut actually requires. Just votes from people watching at home, picking who they liked. The problem with being chosen that way is that it doesn't tell you anything about whether you're actually ready. It just tells you that people liked the person you presented on screen. For someone already unsure of themselves, it's harder to decide whether you deserve your placement or not. Through most of Island, Jungwon's placements were inconsistent. Generally middle or toward the bottom, nothing that pointed clearly in any direction. The BTS mission was the exception, where the producers ranked him second, the first time anyone with professional judgment had singled him out. But that was one mission. The people who decided the final lineup weren't the producers, they were fans, and they put him first. That system produced 7 members. 3 of them would spend the next 2 years trying to convince themselves they belonged in the group it built. The person the public ranked first, the person the public almost didn't choose at all, and the person the system couldn't quite make up its mind about. A few months before the finale, still inside Island, Jungwon filmed a video diary at night, talking about wanting to lift his teammates' spirits up despite his own nerves. He was just a kid who genuinely wanted to take care of the people around him before anyone had asked him to. He wasn't the only one who felt that way, but he was the one who came first. When they debuted, he became the leader, before he had time to process becoming a debut member. Before he'd figured out what any of this meant for himself, he was responsible for 6 other people trying to figure out the same thing. ENHYPEN debuted on November 30th, 2020, with Given Taken as their title track. The song looked at everything they went through in Island and questioned what it meant. Red blood on that crown, my fingertips pointing to you, tinted in red. 5 days before debut, Jae was already comparing himself against the professional artists who'd come before them and finding himself lacking. That was exactly what Given Taken was built around, standing somewhere you're not sure you've earned yet. When the song came out, he said the lyrics captured the complex emotions he was feeling right now. For Jungwon, there was a literal image. He was handed a place in this group at someone else's expense. Though Jungwon never went to the ground, there was a moment when he was supposed to. He was ready to move. However, one of the other Islanders, K, saw something valuable in him. K decided to use his exemption card to save him, and as a result, Taki, another Islander K had grown close to, was eliminated in his place. K was so overwhelmed with guilt he burst crying, even collapsing to the ground as Taki left. Jungwon remained an Island, but it came at the expense of someone else. By the time ENHYPEN debuted, both K and Taki were gone. the person who saved Jungwon's spot never got to stand in the one he helped protect.
솔직히 진짜 딱 다 22명 다 같이 했으면 좋겠는데 그럴 수가 없으니까 진짜 그게 너무 제일 아쉬운 것 같다.
Just weeks after debut, ENHYPEN were performing alongside established artists at a year-end show. For most of the groups on that stage, it was just another performance in their schedule. For ENHYPEN, it was something else entirely. They were the youngest rookies in that building, a group that had existed for less than a month, standing next to artists they'd grown up watching. For Jungwon specifically, the pressure of that was hard to shake off. The whole time he was preparing, he couldn't stop doubting himself. They were the newcomers in a room full of people who had already proven themselves, and he was the one responsible for making sure they didn't look like it. Worse yet, that feeling didn't leave when the show ended. Jungwon was 16, trying to lead 6 people through the exact uncertainty he was experiencing himself. He said in a Weavers magazine interview that addressing team issues still wasn't easy for him, that it was a personality thing he was working on, that when the stress got overwhelming, he went to Heesung. He was 16, holding 6 other people together, while privately he was unsure he was the right person to be doing it. After just a few months away from music shows, Border Carnival came out in late April of 2021. ENHYPEN exploded. The performances were connecting exceptionally well, and for the first time since debut, it felt like the group had found their footing on stage. Jay said after their first Music Bank performance that the show felt cool, that it made him proud, that he was being healed by it. These were kids who genuinely loved being up there, and for a stretch, it showed in everything they did. That same month, Jungwon said this: "I'm not perfect. I'm still one of the members of ENHYPEN. Plus, I'm young, so I think I'm still in the learning stage." Even though ENHYPEN were succeeding, Jungwon was still doubting himself. But it wasn't just him. Jay mentioned back in the summer of 2020, still inside Island, that he'd never guessed he'd make it this far because he wasn't naturally gifted. Sunghoon, on the last day before part 2 began, said honestly that he didn't think he'd improved by a whole lot. Jake was already picking apart the debut album before promotions had even finished. For a group that had just won Rookie of the Year, they seemed surprisingly unsatisfied. Back before they debuted, ENHYPEN spent 40 days figuring out who should lead them. They went through interviews and tests so the company could decide the best fit. In the end, they landed on Heesung and Jungwon. Heesung was theoretically the obvious choice. He was the oldest, he'd practically led the group through Island, and he was already carrying more of the performance than almost anyone else. But he turned it down. He believed he could do much more for the team by stepping back, that the oldest member becoming leader would make the others hesitant to speak their minds. So he said no, and the role went to Jungwon. However, Jungwon wasn't alone. The other members promised to share his weight and to speak up so he wouldn't have to figure everything out on his own. Heesung said publicly that he hoped the burden wouldn't defeat Jungwon just because he was the leader now. Heesung had carried that role through Island. He knew what it did to a person, and the last thing he said to Jungwon about it was that he hoped it wouldn't defeat him. Behind me, thousands of doubts. Behind me, thousands of mistrusts. 2 years from now, ENHYPEN would sell out 2 nights in Seoul, 8,000 people, but right now, they're not even sure they deserve to exist. The question Give & Taken asked on day 1 was still running underneath all of it, whether any of this was given to them or taken by them. Remember the system that chose Jungwon as number 1? That same system had been telling another member something completely different for months. Through most of Island, Sunoo had been the person the public loved the most. He ranked first in the global votes consistently. Evaluation after evaluation, the audience was telling him clearly that he was who they wanted. And then the final vote came, and he placed 8th, near the bottom. In the moment that actually counted, the fans who had chosen him every single time before had moved on. The only reason he's in ENHYPEN today is because that 7th slot was up to the producers. Shortly after the finale, Sunoo mentioned in his video diary that because he was chosen by the producers, he believes he has to try to be even better than before. He was beginning to doubt himself. The constant love people were showering him with had seemingly disappeared completely. They seemingly lost him. He began questioning whether he deserved to be where he was at all. In the weeks after the finale, while still preparing for debut, Sunoo said he felt mentally trapped. He knew this was an incredible opportunity. He knew he should be grateful, but the pressure of it wouldn't lift up, and he couldn't stop feeling it no matter how much he told himself not to. And then ENHYPEN debuted, and despite what he expected, people started showing up and telling him he was making a difference in their lives, that he was cheering them up, that they were doing good things in his name. People loved him, but instead of letting it land, his immediate response was that he better work harder. Not because he was ungrateful, because somewhere underneath all of it, he still couldn't shake the feeling that the people who had chosen him in the end weren't the ones who were supposed to. Jungwon knew the public had chosen him first without fully understanding what they were choosing. Sunoo knew the public had ranked him 8th and someone had overruled it. And then there was a third member, someone who we haven't fully met yet. Nikki started Island in the main building, got moved to the ground after the first mission, and spent most of part 2 toward the bottom of the rankings, though the concept test was the exception, where the producers ranked him 2nd. Then the finale came, and the global vote put him 4th, right in the middle. Not the clear fan favorite, and not the clear producer pick. Shortly after debut, Nikki talked about what Give and Taken meant to him personally. He imagined himself caught between what was given and what was taken. The support, the luck, the talent on one side, and the relentless choice to keep running toward it on the other. Through most of part 2, Nikki had never once broken into the debut 7. By the last global vote, he'd given up hope entirely and was just waiting to be eliminated. After he debuted, that worry didn't go anywhere. Now he wondered whether he could actually do a good job as a member of ENHYPEN. On February 6th, 2021, ENHYPEN performed in front of a live audience for the first time. Not as Island contestants, but as ENHYPEN. And the people in that room had chosen to be there specifically for them. Sunoo couldn't stop crying after they came off stage. Jungwon said afterward that it changed how he saw Engine entirely, that something shifted in that room that hadn't shifted before. Ever since I met Engine in real life, I've been even more touched and grateful for every little thing they do for us. Part of where their doubt came from was the state of the world at this point. It was incredibly hard for them to physically see and be with the people that supposedly cared so much for them. And when they couldn't actually comprehend it, they turned on themselves and believed they were unworthy. However, the pandemic encasing the world was still controlling the world. It was just one event, but for 2 nights, they could see exactly what they were working toward. People who showed up for no other reason than the fact that they wanted to be in the same room as ENHYPEN. The morning after ENConnect, Jungwon filmed a video diary for his birthday, and almost without pausing, he was already thinking about who on the team wasn't feeling their best and what the next album was going to need. Some of us aren't at 100%, so I hope we take good care of ourselves while we prepare for the next album. He just had the most meaningful 2 nights of his career, and he was already somewhere else. Leading 6 people doesn't leave much room to sit inside a good moment, and for Jungwon, it never really did. Border Carnival, which released in April 2021, connected really well with audiences. It racked up 3 music show wins, a huge accomplishment for any group, but especially one that only recently debuted. Though Drunk Dazed was anything but an exception, they continued to succeed on music shows. Tame Dashed won on 3 shows in October 2021, Blessed Curse took 2 in January 2022, Future Perfect in July. In between all of it, there were moments that felt genuinely good. Sunhoon said after one of their Drunk Days stages that he hadn't had that much fun on a stage in a long time. These were massive achievements for them, and all 7 of them felt that. However, for Nikki, none of it stuck. The wins would certainly land, but it never was enough. By the end of 2021, Nikki said he wanted to focus on preparing performances so that they wouldn't be ashamed of themselves in front of Engine. Even after all their success that year, that was still the bar he was measuring himself against. The more you succeed, the harder it becomes to believe you deserve it. Every win adds more evidence that you belong, And somehow that makes the fear of being found out even worse. Because now there's more to lose. More people watching. More proof that if you really were a fraud, the fall would be that much further. That's imposter syndrome. And it had been sitting inside ENHYPEN since before they ever debuted. It's why Jungwon's scared of letting not only his fellow members down, but the other island applicants. It's why Sunoo believed he had to do better because the producers chose him. It's why Nikki was so terrified of putting on a shameful performance. 3 completely different paths that each led to the same feeling, and 2 years of success hadn't moved any of them out of it. 6 months into being a leader, Jungwon acknowledged something. Before, when he first took up the role, he didn't know what to do for the other members, how to confront things, what a leader even was. But now, he knew enough to know what he needed to do, and people trusted him. I don't think the job of being a leader is something you do alone. The members promised him that on the night it was announced. 6 months later, he was leaning on them. September 18th, 2022. 2 years to the day since Island ended. Since 7 names were called in front of a live broadcast and ENHYPEN became a real thing. They were back in Seoul now, the second night of their first Korean concert. 8,000 people had shown up across 2 nights. Not to vote for a favorite on a survival show, and not because an algorithm put ENHYPEN in front of them, but because they wanted to be there. The last song of the night was Shout Out, the final thing they'd perform before the lights came up and the show was over. Nikki says he nearly broke down on stage. Back at their fan meeting in 2021, he had, but he didn't want it to happen again. He'd made mistakes throughout the show, and he was aware of them. The crowd was bursting with energy. Thousands of people who had traveled specifically to be in that building for ENHYPEN, and Nikki spent the whole night furious at himself. Every moment that hadn't been perfect was sitting on top of him while the room celebrated around him. A collective 8,000 people were having the night of their lives, and he was somewhere else entirely, locked inside every mistake, unable to just be there with them. He held back his emotions. That night, in his video diary, he explained why.
날 때는 정말 자기 자신한테 오늘 무대는 정말 잘했다. 이렇게 뭔가 느꼈을 때만 눈물이 나올 것 같아요, 앞으로. 안 그러면 울 자격이 없으니까, 이제.
And on the night that should have been the answer to every doubt he'd carried since Island, he still felt like he hadn't earned it yet. The Manifesto World Tour wouldn't wrap until February 2023. Nikki had spent the whole Seoul concert furious at himself for the mistakes he'd made. Jungwon, reflecting on 2 months of shows across America and Japan, said he wasn't satisfied with most of his performances either. Still critical of himself, he was already thinking about what he still needed to fix, and already making promises to himself about the next time. A few weeks earlier, in a hotel room in America, Sunoo said something into his camera.
이게 진짜 저희가 해도 되는 건가? 라는 생각도 조금 들기는 했어요. 그랬는데
He was genuinely happy to be there, grateful for what the tour had shown him about how many people loved ENHYPEN. But yet, he said he still had so much more growing to do. Even though they doubted their abilities, the tour kept going, ENHYPEN kept going, just as they always had. At the very beginning of this video, I showed you 2 lines from the song they debuted with. Behind me, thousands of doubts. Behind me, thousands of mistrusts. However, there's a third line. There's always been a third line here. But I go now, after my dreams. They never stopped doubting themselves, but they never stopped showing up either. And maybe that's always been enough. If you want to see what happens when a group becomes too big for the world that built them, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching. Bye 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 bye.